Then you have the opportunity to ask them what's on your mind. So, for our first, revolutionary optimism in a capitalist society that alienates us, that exhausts us, is oftentimes a muscle that we may forget to flex. Can each of you speak to how we can understand revolutionary optimism as a collective act, not a solitary act? By using this reframe, what are the ways that we can cultivate revolutionary optimism as we're confronted with narratives of despair and helplessness?
Hi everyone. I'm gonna try to compose myself. I'm feeling super emotional coming out of the keynote, and also feeling really uplifted from seeing such a packed room with a bunch of folks coming from all over the country, maybe and from other countries as well. And I think this conference is doing what it needs to do to revive our commitment and our spirit of consistently mobilizing for 8 months. And to underscore what Lara said, is this too loud? Or, no? Okay. Yes? Okay. I think others are saying it's good, so I'll just keep going. But to underscore something that Lara said around the exhaustion and the grief and the anger that all of us have felt, and also feeling positive emotions as well of being in community with folks, of deep love for our people and for our communities and for each other, that has been able to sustain us for 8 months despite watching a genocide being live streamed, where I don't think we've ever seen this within our lifetime, surely not mine. And so it's incredibly difficult. And I think with that, maybe for those that are newer to organizing, maybe feel a little bit isolated or alienated or don't have community yet. And so I want to speak to the interpersonal and to the emotional aspect, because I feel like this is something that we actually don't discuss in organizing spaces a lot, but it's very important. And especially if you're in an organization or a part of a collective, your relationship, you being in good health, is very important, and also the relationships you have with each other must be built on trust, which also requires, sharing your emotions. So, maybe many of you have gone through various periods throughout the last 8 months where you're struggling with making sense of your feelings while absorbing the reality that we're seeing and understanding the conditions of our subjugation. And many of us came into struggle through crystallizing events. Maybe for some of us it was the invasion of Iraq. Maybe it's the previous wars on Gaza. Maybe it was 2021 during the Unity Intifada. Or maybe it's today, post-October 7th, with the genocide that we're seeing. And it's this simultaneous feelings of despair, grief, rage, etc., but also resilience and resistance, watching thousands of our people being martyred. And so with that, we have to remember that we have a responsibility and an obligation to the people of Gaza, to the people of Palestine, and to all oppressed masses to be able to meet this moment. And we must understand that this unique role that we have and to rise up to the moment means developing political consciousness, being in the streets, and being organized. So I think the main themes I'm going to speak to around how to cultivate and maintain revolutionary optimism is, of course, like your individual well-being, which is very important, but also the significance of political education and ideological conviction. And organization. So I want to talk a little bit about ideological conviction and why it's significant. And I want to reflect about the Trinity of Fundamentals. How many of you have read it? Okay, nice. Okay, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit because I think the main thrust of this book through the character of Canaan is the contradiction between your human self and your revolutionary self. And we must understand that contradictions, while, there's ebbs and flows, we have to endure these contradictions, and we have our revolutionary self has the responsibility of weaving the threads together between these two personalities that we have. And so maybe there's, weeks where you're overcome with grief, and this is very human. And I've definitely experienced that where I felt like I'm just like, I can't move on sometimes. And, other times I'm moved by deep love and understanding that these emotions are very human because, in the words of Aaron Bushnell, this is what our ruling class thinks is normal. And we should refuse to normalize this level of death and destruction that we're seeing in Gaza. And so to talk a little bit about the Trinity of Fundamentals and the difficulty maybe you all are experiencing being in the streets of organizing, teaching, there's this quote that I want to speak to in the novel where he says, "Immerse yourself deeper and deeper into your experience in your life. Let its waters wash over you. Let it scrub your skin with soap and brush. Let it leaven you with its yeast. Let it forge you in its furnace. Then and only then can you say, I'm the owner of this experience." And so we have to remember that we, as individuals and as collectives, we're the makers of history. And history is a register open to whoever has the determination to make an entry. And so revolutionary optimism is so important in this moment to sustain ourselves in order to correct the march of history. And so I want to talk a little bit about ideological conviction. Sorry. We are taught, usually as Palestinians especially, we're taught our history through a lens of defeatism. Like, I know I hear my parents say, why are you protesting? We've done that. It's not going to happen. Palestine won't be liberated. I'm sure a lot of us have heard this. And we, in turn, have internalized this defeat. Revolutionary optimism, again, is the concept that is going to move us from being passive subjects of history to active agents of it. And so I want to also talk about, I want to reference a quote by George Jackson in Blood in My Eye, where he says, "Consciousness is the opposite of indifference, and promoting consciousness involves the dissemination of the concept that each of us is a part of a universal action and interaction." And so throughout the Trinity of the Fundamentals and weaving together Wissam Rafidi, who was a political prisoner himself with the experience of George Jackson, that consciousness, political consciousness, is a choice, is an obligation and a duty that we have, and it's a commitment that we need to renew every single day. Because, we see some people in the movement organizing for decades, and there's moments of disillusionment. If we think about Oslo, for example, people become disillusioned with the political process or what they think is a political solution, and they stop being revolutionaries, they stop organizing. And so ideological conviction means that every day we wake up and we ask ourselves, what are we going to do today that's going to advance the struggle for the liberation of Palestine? What am I going to study? What skill sets am I going to develop to advance the liberation of my struggle? And so this requires an optimism that while you understand these conditions that subjugate us here in North America, but also the oppressed masses everywhere, that we have a commitment to overcome, to first understand, study these systems of oppression, and to make a commitment to say, well, how am I going to commit to struggle? And so for me, is political conviction study ideological conviction that strengthens us in our convictions that keep us rooted. It's organization of actually then you as an individual making a promise and a commitment with your comrades, with people that you struggle alongside with, that you're dedicating your skill sets and your knowledge to advance struggle and to bring more people into movement, because we know that it's not just the individual that's, that has the power necessarily, and we find strength in the collective. And so noting the significance of political organization in this moment. Maybe I'll stop there, I think, and yeah, this can be a conversation.
يا هلا يا هلا كيف الكل؟ نه؟ Thank you everybody, and thank you Sara for inviting me, and thank you to all the organizers. I can't I think this is part of revolutionary optimism, is being in the present today and recognizing that 7 months ago, 8 months ago, a year ago, we could never have imagined that we'd be in a space like this together. It's creating these portals and bringing them into being, and this is precisely what this is. This is a portal that has been created. We've stepped through it, and here we are today to talk together and be together and feel together. And so I also, part of revolutionary optimism is inviting the affect into the room. There's so much affect. I'm filled with it. I'm filled with rage. I'm filled with love. I'm filled with sadness. And this is not just because I'm a shrink talking about feelings. This is what we're made of, and part of what allows our portals to be sustainable and allows us to continue the struggle forward. So thank you for being in this room here today, and for everybody who had a hand in labor in making this happen. So, yeah, not enough clapping to go around. So I've already made my confession. I'm not a pessimistic revolutionary leftist. This pessimism's got no place in my heart. And part of that is because, rejecting the concept of optimism. Oftentimes, I think we think about pessimism and optimism as sort of, dual forces. And we have the right to be kind of suspect of optimism that's a commodity, right? And so sometimes we walk away from optimism because we were like, okay, something's acting on me. I'm being asked, I'm being seduced by capitalism, by commodification, by tokenism, whatever the thing is. But I think there's a way in which we can refuse the commodity of optimism and move away from alienation and numbing, and instead think about this revolutionary optimism in the face of structures and machinery that would have us crumble, as precisely the way that we can create these portals that we're just talking about. And how, as a psychologist and as a feminist and as an abolitionist, I'm always thinking about the ways in which this can be done through psychic refusals against psychic intrusion, because we know that psyops is the way that these things get lodged inside of us. So this is what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about revolutionary optimism, I'm also talking about the ways in which we can engage actively in resisting the psychic intrusions, in resisting psychic collapse, and most importantly, resisting psychic foreclosures. And what do I mean by that? Foreclosures are the ways that settler colonial logics, imperialism, capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, all the things that create the shit of our world, come inside of us and make us believe there is no other way, right? This conference, what has happened, what folks in Gaza showed us October 7th is there is always another way. There is a way through that wall, right? And in that moment, when a jarrafe, right, becomes the symbol that used to actually be used for house demolition, becomes a symbol in which that seas come down. We see it transform in front of our eyes, right? That is what I'm talking about, moving past foreclosures, and that's the place that I want to start. So just two quotes that I want to ground us here and what grounds me. One of them is by Leila Khaled. I want to give a shout out to my partner and comrade in Revolutionary Love, Istfin, for bringing this to my attention. This is the other way that we sustain revolutionary optimism, through love. So Leila Khaled's quote here, she's on a hunger strike, fainting and about going to the hospital, and she writes this, she says, "I sat down in the hospital and wrote a few notes, taking my inspiration from Che's immortal dictum. We must grow tough, but without ever losing our tenderness." So that's number one. The second one is from Basil El-Araj. And I love that he's here and with us throughout the talks today. So this is the quote. "You, the academically inclined, set your sights on disenchanting all things by defining and explaining, reckoning that it will land you on the truth. In these overcast days, I tell you, I need no explanatory framework for rainfall, whether it's Thor's hammer or God's mercy or meteorologist's consensus. I want none of it. What I want is my unabating wonder and my silly smile whenever the rain falls. every time as if the first time, a child bewitched and the magic of the world. That's it. And so for me, these two together ground me. These two statements that ground us, right? Our comrades who have fallen and who have fought to guide us to what revolutionary optimism means. Beyond hope, it's a wajib, right? Wajib علينا. It's our duty to have revolutionary optimism as a commitment, a political commitment. It's a political commitment to be able to see the beauty in this room. So many of us now walk around and we say, okay, we see kufiyas. But I want us to wind backwards and think about a time when you might have been the only person in the room with a kufiya. Right? That's the enchantment we're talking about. When we walk down the street and we lock eyes with somebody wearing a kufi, when we're in the street, when we remember our tenderness, that's a moment, that's a commitment, that's a wajib. And that's a psychic process. It's a psychic process of remembering every single time that going back to that moment of tenderness, going back to that moment of enchantment, it is a commitment because it is hard to do that. We wake up every single day and we say, I commit to revolutionary optimism. I commit to not just the belief, but the surety that Palestine will be liberated. This type of daily commitment is an alignment. It's a psychic alignment. It's a psychic alignment that is underscored by revolutionary love and by enchantment, by us seeing the special moments, by seeing how moving it is to be in community together, to see Sana and Milad walk through and all of us have tears stuck in our throat and understand what it took for her to be there, right? Never taking those moments for granted, but in fact, naming every single process. This is not small. This is a huge psychic feat to be able to do this, and that's why I've committed myself in my own study about psychology to say what makes those moments actually necessary, to be able to break them down and say this is actually a sophisticated act for us to see all the steps that allowed this to happen is part of the way we sustain revolutionary optimism and at the same time fight against psychic intrusion. Why is this important? It's because this is the way that we resist the commodification of despair and trauma, right? Every time we feel despair and trauma, it's not to say that there aren't horrors that are going on. It's not to say that we don't stop in our tracks and literally feel a part of our heart break open that we didn't know even existed when we see a mass grave that has a zip tie the size of a baby's arm. Stopping in our tracks is precisely what keeps us in our humanity and what allows us to sustain the revolutionary optimism, because I want to live in a world in which the conditions that created that possibility could never come into being. Resisting commodification, despair, and trauma psychologically means that this is precisely what we recognize in those moments of despair. To recognize that something is being acted upon us, that there are forces that have coordinated together to live inside of us psychologically, emotionally, affectively. That's why Frantz Fanon talked about the psychopolitico-affective, because he understood that the political always had to have an affective, an emotional, and a psychological bent to come live inside of us and stop us in our tracks. But can we stop in our tracks in service of revolution versus in service of crumbling? Every single time you feel yourself stop and you say, I am tired, I am despairing, it's a reminder that one of these systems is working on you, and it's working. Right? It's a reminder to say there's a psyops at play. And even that acknowledgement alone is enough to speak against it, is to allow us to refuse that psychic intrusion. This is kind of what you were saying, Lina, right? Is that their settler colonial logics, the way they work, they're meant to atomize us. They're meant to make us feel like small individuals that are not connected up to each other. Right? They're meant to make us feel alone. They're meant to make us feel despairing. So speaking back to them, Speaking against them is a way that we remember, both in terms of memory, but also against dismemberment, dismembering us. The same way that Palestine has been dismembered, why wouldn't we use the same machinery against us psychically as well? And so part of the speaking back is to remember, both memory-wise, and then come back together. And then to reassociate when we are meant to disassociate. Whether that's disassociate affectively, like I cannot even handle or process what's happening, but to remember that that inability to metabolize and process is precisely you insisting on your humanity and on a resistance of psychic intrusion. Because the moment that you are able to dissociate from the horrors that are happening, it's the moment that you know that the psyops has worked. The last thing I'll say, and this is in keeping with what Lina was saying earlier, is to move away from this idea of failures. It is really easy for us to say this thing failed and this thing failed and this is the way, what happened before and we have to learn. There's a difference between us learning strategically from the mistakes that might have happened and learning from our ancestors and learning from our comrades and all this, and moving away from the reading of it as a failure. Instead, we learn from abolitionists, and most of them are Black feminist abolitionists, that teach us that these are rehearsals, that every single time there was a failure, number one, who's calling it a failure and who's not, and number two, that it's a rehearsal for the next time that comes. It's a rehearsal to seize the moment, right? This is precisely what happened. Decades and decades and decades of so-called failures have allowed us to see millions and millions and millions of people in the street. That doesn't happen if we're actually thinking about them as failures. And these might seem like, just statements or empty statements, but I know how it feels for these things to become lodged inside of you. I know psychologically what it's working on when we sit there and we go, what's happened, right? Where are we right now? This many months later, and nothing has happened. They said it today when we were talking in the student plenary. It's like so much has happened, and that's actually a political and psychological commitment for us to be able to truth tell about all the moving pieces that got us to this moment today. And this is the abolitionist sort of phrasing of building the future from the present. Every single moment is a moment of us building for the future in constant movement, right? To enact the worlds that right now we are all coming together to say, not only dream about, but actually enact.
Thank you for introducing those concepts and themes that you found most useful. Like Lina, you were saying the moments of disillusionment, and you were also the moments of enchantment, sort of that binary, and also going through the refusal of optimism as a commodity, and then the importance of political organization, tying those together beautifully. Thank you. So we understand revolutionary optimism as a collective act, not just a solitary one. Or as Lara puts it, when settler colonialism sears itself into the collective consciousness, we must make a conscious and exhaustive effort to maintain the ideological fight. And as you mentioned, Lina, the ideological conviction. There is no alternative to endurance. We try to seed and root as we are constantly being uprooted. We try to maintain this defiant insistence to embody the Palestinian spirit of willful refusal and pursuit of dignity. But what happens if we falter? What happens if we falter as we attempt to sustain the revolutionary optimism relationally and collectively? And also, how do we address the attempts of imperial entities to create movement splits and factionalize the unity that we've cultivated?
Okay. I want to expand on something that Lara eloquently put around the psychological impact around giving in to despair and what that does to you. And I think actually, in the Trinity of Fundamentals, there were moments for Canaan, the main character of the novel, where he did give in to despair. His human self, which I think we all have, and we have these, thoughts, and it's very human, again, but like Lara mentioned, like, how are we breaking out of that, and how are we sustaining our optimism, both as an individual practice, but collectively through our organizing? And so I want to draw on this quote from the book again, and I hope you all don't mind, but I think this book has really, really, really grounded me and really helped me, and was kind of like free therapy for me, honestly, at this time. And so there's a part of the novel where Kanaan says, "This stage is very difficult, and there is no alternative to endurance. Our day will come, I don't know when, but it will come, and our efforts will not be wasted." And I think it's worth mentioning how he expresses we cannot only have endurance in moments of revolution, but also needing to have endurance of moments of capitulation and in moments of setback. And so what's significant about this novel is that Kanaan relied on his party. He relied on the relationship he had with his comrades, with his family, to sustain his optimism whenever he falters and whenever his revolutionary self that maybe was disillusioned with the political moment that he was in, he could rely on this foundation that he's built and that he's a part of collectives and that his relationships sustain him. And so we need to rely on our comrades, we need to rely on our friends and family, we need to rely and feel grounded in our history, as like Palestinian history, but other oppressed people's histories too, and revolutionary culture of music, of art to sustain us. And we need to find strength and hope that this is an intergenerational struggle, that we are carrying the legacies of those that came before us. We're synthesizing, we're studying their experiences, and then transforming it to our contemporary conditions, to, like I said before, to correct the march of history. And that even if we don't see liberation within our lifetime, which I'm sure we will, but despite that, we know that our comrades that will come after us will build on our lessons and carry our struggle forward until victory. And so, thanks. I want to talk a little bit. I want to talk about this moment in Palestinian history, which for maybe those that are not as intimately familiar, around the post-Oslo period and the disillusionment around the liquidation of a liberation project, where this revolutionary Palestinian identity that was once crafted to be able to wage a national liberation struggle kind of like was liquidated of its revolutionary contents. And in this way, the novel, like the Trinity of Fundamentals, it's kind of, and this moment, this mass movement, is kind of reviving a revolutionary identity of what it means to be a part of a political project. And again, the thread here, the main principles are ideological conviction and being committed to one's political project, no matter if your position is on the side of victory or whether it's in a moment of weakness. And to speak to the part of the question around how to address when these systems are conspiring against us, and they are, and they're obviously wanting to weaken the gains that we've been able to achieve over the last few months, we need to turn back to history, and we need to study the experiences of revolutionary movements in this country and, of course, in the global south, to find ways to cultivate and to sustain revolutionary optimism, because we are ultimately building upon history. And ultimately that means while we study the successes and the failures of revolutionary movements in the past, we also need to study the repression that these movements were met with around COINTELPRO measures here in this country that have liquidated the Black liberation struggle, the indigenous movements here, and still to this day. That were meant to liquidate and to fracture revolution, to fracture the social fabric of the support for these movements. And so we know that we're going to be met with heightened repression, And we see some of the language with the encampments, especially around this language of outside agitators, that it's only that revolution should only be waged by the students, and it's only relegated, only should be advanced by one specific segment of our society, and that it's not in all of our collective interests. Just speaking to the fact that there are primary and secondary contradictions, and that it was a theme in the last panel that we had around needing a united front, of knowing that our primary contradiction in this moment is the Zionist imperialist alliance. And this means that the primary question and the primary force that we're struggling against requires a united front to wage a struggle against this contradiction. And so, various revolutionaries like Lenin, like George Jackson and his works, and others have conceptualized this strategy of a united front, whereby these various elements of progressive forces are able to unite around this shared understanding of what the primary contradiction is, and be in a shared struggle to defeat this immediate and primary interests of the working class and oppressed masses against imperialist aggression. And then the secondary contradictions around these internal differences between these progressive forces in our movement, they're going to exist, and that's natural, and they come up, of course. But we must not let the secondary contradiction confuse our path, confuse how we relate to each other, in order to be able to smash the Zionist imperialist alliance. That means we must engage each other in good faith. That means we must establish trust between one another and partnerships to unite and struggle against these forces that are seeking to liquidate our collective liberation.
So we're checking in on time. We want to leave room for folks to ask questions. I want to answer this again with a psychological sort of bent to it. And I've been hearing from a lot of students, both in at my former employer, George Washington University, and then in other places, about factionalism. Thank you. Yes. About the factionalism that happens, and I sort of just want to speak directly to that. And I'm speaking to you, by the way, as a Lebanese Arab, and this is really important about that. And it's a Lebanese Arab who I always joke with my Palestinian comrades and those who I organize with that my blood is Palestinian. And this means this is more than just a slogan. It means it's a refusal to forget how Lebanese and Palestinians have always been in the struggle together. It's a refusal against it's a refusal against the imperialist borders that separate us. It's a refusal against all the ways in which we have been told that our struggles are not intertwined, or that somehow it's just Jnub Lebanon that are involved in that. It's all of Lebanon and it's all of Palestine. That's where the seeds of factionalism start, when we start to believe their lies, when we start to believe the imperial lies, when we start to actually put affective power in those borders and somehow think that they're natural. And that's, again, the ways that they come to live inside of us. We are seeing the seeds of that when we see there's a factionalism in our movements, or when we start to see that somehow factionalism is not natural, right? They start to talk to us in negative ways, like, look, you guys can't even agree amongst each other what you're going to do. Well, of course we're not going to agree. We're trying to build a revolutionary world. This thing needs process and working through and struggle, right? So that's part of it too, is to say no, that part of it is to normalize, depathologize. What settler colonial logics and oppressive systems do is pathologize the normal and normalize the pathological. And so but for us to normalize that there's going to be struggle, that we're going to sit down and we're going to have different opinions, and part of our process is working through that and saying, okay, in every moment we are moving towards the goal. We understand and we have in our eyes and in our target what the larger problem is, what the condition of oppression is, and how we work through that process is an everyday commitment that goes back to that optimism, right? And that's a commitment that we need to sort of focus on when we're talking about factionalism. So what is it that creates the conditions for factionalism? It's always going back to the original condition that might create oppression to begin with. And here's where I want to call in Frantz Fanon, who's a centerpiece in much of our work. But also, if just like Lina was saying, is to learn from comrades, is that we need to read Fanon as a comrade, right? So my dear comrade and Black feminist revolutionary Gail Lewis taught me this, and this is how we can sort of take that forward and take Fanon forward. I'm going to read just a quote from him here to stabilize us, to sort of link us into why we should not be surprised that there's an imperial project to factionalize us. And these are his words. I say that such a system established by violence, and here he's talking about colonialism, can logically only be faithful to itself, and its duration in time depends on the continuation of that violence, right? And so if we can understand that that colonialism can only be faithful to itself and its own longevity, and will use anything in its way as a weapon to make sure that it's stabilized and has a future, then we can start to understand why factionalism becomes a centerpiece for the PSYOPs, why it has to target us, why it has to come in and create wedges between us, why it has to come in into the student movement, for example. Any place there's an affective charge, it will be targeted. And when we can understand that as a logic that repeats itself against time, across history, across geographies, across movements, then we can also start to read that logic and be ready to respond to that logic before it even sets in. We can start to read it in every single way, right? It helps us stay attuned to the structures rather than think about them or receive them as individual moments in time. Like somehow this just happens here and this just happens here and this just happens here, rather than read it as a contiguous sort of formation across time, as a structure, as a logic of oppression that will show up at our doorsteps. It will show up at our feet, and that's why we have to be ready for it and psychologically sound in reading its operations. So don't be surprised by these attempts, right? Understand that normativity is the way that oppressive structures work and flow through us. Understand that anytime a system is destabilized, it will work for its longevity and restabilize by any means necessary, which is why we must destabilize by any means necessary consistently.
Cutting off Lara is my biggest nightmare, and also Lina, so I'm so sorry to you both. I will be as quick as I can to wrap us with this last question, and if you both could take a minute or two each, that would be wonderful. To reframe or frame the last part of our conversation, I would like to share the words of Dr. Wissam Rafidi and Walid Daqqa, in which they both express similar dynamic conceptions of space and time in history. NSJP hosted a student morale call with Lara and Wissam, and he shared some words that I'd like to relate to you and offer to you now. He says, what is happening now is a student intifada, a global intifada, a reminder that between 1980 and 1987, the youth movement was involved in so much was being done and rehearsed, all to get to this moment to erupt. Every moment, every little thing came together and made it so that history could be made. Walid, in his letter written to a friend on the 21st year of his political imprisonment, he identified his struggle by coalescing the stretch of time that he spent in prison, characterizing the Palestinian prisoner's existence as temporal. He writes, I write to you from the parallel time. Here, where space is constant, we are in a time before the end of the Cold War, but before the First, Second, and Third Gulf Wars, before Madrid and Oslo, before the outbreak of the First and Second Intifadas, before cell phones, modern communication systems, and the internet. We are a part of history, and history is obviously a state of past events that have come to an end, except for us. For us, history is a continuous past that never ends. With the words of Uli Daqqa and Wissam Rafidi, the past is reconceptualized. The past is not a distant culmination of failures, but necessary moments connected to this present juncture of disruption that has shaken the imperial status quo. And if the two of you could share in 2 minutes each, just share more about your understanding of time as a continuous flow of revolutionary action and the student movement's role in this continuity. I know that's such a loaded question, which I find impossible, but I mean, you can do the impossible.
I'll be super, super quick, and please forgive me because I keep going back to this novel. But so Wissam talks about in the book about the university of a space that like brings together different people from different class backgrounds, that has allowed for political development. It's a hotbed of political activity, and he outlines 3 categories for understanding how people can develop revolutionary commitment and consciousness on the campus. One, he says that there's ideological conviction that lasts past graduation, that these are people that are committed all the time to revolution. There's number 2, revolution until graduation, where university is really the only arena where they're active, and then after they graduate, they get a job, they settle down, they have a family, and they're not committed to revolution day in and day out. And then the last one, where you might have, a partner that is committed to struggle, but you're kind of on the edge and they're really your only connection to revolution. And whether that relationship continues, is successful, you might be part of struggle, but if you guys break up, then it's over. You're not committed to revolution. So he distinguishes these 3 different kinds of people, where they may or may not develop a political consciousness. And so just speaking to the contemporary moment, there's of course like the student movement ultimately has revived the spirit of the struggle. But thinking about this moment of spontaneity around how do we sustain this movement for the long term. And I think the main question here is, how do we produce organizers for the long term? How do we achieve that? How do we develop their skill sets? How do we build on their consciousness? And it's ideological conviction, and I'll keep saying this over and over again. And so it's an ongoing practice to maintain revolutionary action and maintain ideological conviction in order to advance our struggle forward. And you can lose both. You can lose ideological commitment. You can lose your commitment. And in the preface of the novel, he talks a lot about this disillusionment, and we can't underscore how strong this force is for the reasons that Lara laid out around alienation and commodification and individualism, these things that are so central to capitalism, that pushes us to be divorced from each other, divorced from struggle. And so we need to recognize that this is a choice we have to make every day. We have to renew our commitment every day. And the universities are only one site where we wage a struggle, and it's an incredibly important front, and students, we know this, have always played an historic role to advance revolutionary change on the campus and beyond. And we saw what that meant, the full display of the fascist repression waged against our students, who ultimately put their bodies and their lives on the front lines in an effort to end this genocide. And so we know that even when the encampments go down, we know that there will be another one that comes up. But even after this moment, the student movement, the encampments, it was a success in and of itself because it revived the spirit of our movement. It offered moral and political clarity, and has demonstrated to people that they have a role in this struggle that goes beyond this specific moment. And even if this tactic ultimately didn't achieve the political goal, it brought out the masses and developed their consciousness. And I'll leave it at that.
It was such an honor to be in conversation with Wissam, and it was so moving. I think so many of us were just in tears sort of listening to him narrate this idea. And so when you ask this question, Sada, I'm thinking about a challenge to us from our comrades, like Wissam, to defy settler colonial time. right? And what do I mean by this? I mean that settler colonial time, as part of the logics of settler colonial machinery, will have us believe that time is linear and is only unidirectional, and it only, like capitalism, just goes in one direction. We know that that is not the case. We understand the past, present, and future as simultaneously always in existence, and that in and of itself is a psychological process that we can commit to, right? Defy settler colonial time. And here's why it happens. There's things that are, we just saw that in Milad. That's a defiance of settler colonial time. Past, present, and future in one. We also see it in Palestine, right? We see, if we were to just say this is of the past, right? When sometimes folks will say historical Palestine, rather than seeing it in front of our eyes with an overlay of a settler colonial apartheid genocidal regime, that Palestine continues to be from the river to the sea. It hasn't disappeared. What I mean about defying settler colonial time, and to remember also that in our moments when we are most raw, we also understand what it means to defy time in a linear fashion, because we're both past and present, and then always thinking about what are we going to become. So you already have examples of that, of how we defy settler colonial time. The way also to think about it is refuse the seduction of the temporal stamp. That temporal stamp of this movement happened here, and these are the years in which it happened. And then another thing that starts is precisely what separates us and is always framed by settler colonialism and imperialism. This is when this movement began. This is when it ended. This is when this movement began. This is when it ended. This is precisely how we're disconnected from each other, right? The students in their movements, whether it's the students in Palestine or the students in Lebanon or the students in Sudan or the students here in Turtle Island, we're showing that you're not just indirectly, you are directly connected to revolutionary movements, right? So Sada asked Wissam, what is it like, what would you say to students who sort of want to do justice by the comrades that came before us? And he responded, and I was so moved by it, and I'm in agreement. And he said, you all have done something more than we ever could have imagined, even in the first Intifada. Right? And to say that we are connected up with you, that you are now part of Palestinian history, that these movements precisely are like that. If you are part of Palestinian history, you are also part of the Palestinian present and the Palestinian future, and that's how we refuse this. I want to end with giving love to my student, Shahid, Palestinian student, who I have the honor of teaching and being in conversation with in Qatar. And in her, I'm teaching decolonial and liberatory psychology, and in her final paper, she wrote about seeing the video of the primal scream that Columbia students and the community in New York did in front of Columbia University's abhorrent president's house. Exactly, big boo. We don't claim her. Exactly. And what she said, what she wrote was so moving, and exactly an example of this. She said, when I first saw that video, at first I laughed because it was shock. And then I burst into tears because these students were ventriloquizing for me the scream that I have had stuck inside me and in my throat for so many years as somebody occupied in Palestine, and it transported and defied borders, time, and geographical space to be in the context of the United States.
I will try to make this a 30-minute Q&A. Sorry, PYM. 7:05, 7 o'clock. But I'm going to hand out the mic to people who have questions, so please raise your hand. We'll take 2 to 3 per round.
Okay. I'll start closest to me.
Thank y'all so much for an amazing talk. Lina, I really appreciate you bringing up George Jackson's Blood in My Eye, because I always engage that text as a deeply powerful book rooted in revolutionary optimism and love, as well as a really important toolkit for us in how to wage armed resistance. George Jackson wrote that book in many ways as a love letter to his young brother Jonathan. After his passing, he said, "My beautiful baby boy armed with a submachine gun. I taught him how to walk. I wanted to teach him how to fly. I will regard him in the way that I do Che Guevara." I think that same love we see in Palestinian men and women and the resistance fighters in every action and to their last breath. And I wanted to ask you all to maybe speak towards how we can make sure that we do not stop revolutionary optimism and love short of armed resistance. As amazing as George Jackson's Blood in My Eye was, our equally beloved elder Bell Hooks, when she read it at the time, characterized it as a armed resistance, as a misogynistic tool of resistance. And with all mercy and grace, we're not asking perfection of our elders, but I think it really speaks to the ways in which the fractionalizing of us. And I think Palestinian women have done an amazing job at rejecting and refusing that characterization of Palestinian men. I was hoping y'all could speak towards that.
Okay, I'm going to make this brief. Wow, this is louder than I expected. Okay, I'm trying not to get shy, kind of loud. All right, point is, it goes without saying, everything that's been coming out of that you guys have been saying, just wonderful insight and all kinds of little gems of knowledge that, I haven't taken this many notes since I've been in high school, so that should say something. I want to get from you, I'll make this brief, I want to get from you guys personally, what historical example of struggle and liberation and what historical fight for national liberation, for revolution in the past has inspired you, like specifically something that puts a fire on you and goes, wow, this is the stuff of legend. Because for me personally, it's hearing about I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the story of Ricardo Flores Magón and the PLM, the original agitators and the real triggers for the Mexican Revolution. Coined the phrase of tierra y libertad before Zapata even said it. Zapata got it from their magazine. So it's something like that. The constant struggle and the commitment of just a few individuals, no money, no food, having to move from city to city, something like that. What's something that really inspires you in that frame? All right, I'm done.
Okay. Hi, I'm gonna try to do this in English because I'm from Puerto Rico. My name is Veronica. Thanks. I came here with Chariana. Chariana is one of the co-founding members of my organization, which is La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción. I'm really emotional right now. I just want to say some things. I'm going to try to be quick. Thanks for this conversation. It's really important. And as Lina said, when I start, getting to the militant part of my life, which was when I was 16 or 18 in Puerto Rico, we didn't talk about, how to be optimist or how to be, to find the outlets, maybe, to refresh. And this, I think that space like this are really refreshing. I was saying this morning to some of your comrades that it's really welcoming for me this space because I don't have to explain anyone what is colonialism. This is like my 4th conference in the US and the first one where I don't have to explain what colonialism looks like. Thank you. I think that for us in La Colectiva right now, something that we have been cultivating these past 2-3 years is the importance of discipline, compromise, honesty, and trust. As Grace Lee Boggs said once, we need to cultivate critical relations. And for me, it's really important, I don't have to like you to be in the struggle with you. I have to trust you, to respect you, and to treat you with honesty. To be also optimistic. I need to know that and to trust that when I feel sad or when I have to grieve something, probably next week is my comfort turn. And in order to do that, we need to be really disciplined, because when I took my self-care time, someone is doing my work. So we need to abolish or some kind of abolish the self-love, thing. We like to call in La Cole entrecuido. I don't know how that translates in English, but probably it's like the collective care is not self-care, because there is no such thing as self-care. Someone always thinks you care of what you don't do at some time. And in terms of other two things to finish, first, the repression. In the case of Puerto Rico, they thought, in history that the independent movement has failed because of repression, and in some part that's true, but it's really important for, to carve the history, because we need to learn a lot about, or to oral history from our elders, because repression is important, but how they dealt with difference was awful. And for us right now in the present, it's really important to learn how to deal with differences, because when the repression is here and it's always here, knocking the door, we need to stay together out of the differences, because if not, we're gonna fail. And that's really important in the Puerto Rican history. And in terms of images, when I feel sad or really pessimistic, I love to think about the image of the Vieques struggle, against the Marine of the U.S. I don't know if you guys know, but the Vieques is like an island part of Puerto Rico. And in there, they used to practice, with the bombs that they threw in Vietnam. They practice in Vieques, and in Vieques, there's still people living. And the Viequenses made the Marina go, for the, I don't know, someone speaks Spanish? They expelled them in the 2000s early, but that struggle lasts for maybe more than 40 years, and it's still, they want to clean the territory. And there's this image of un pescador, a fisherman in his little boat, with una resortera, a slingshot, against the Marine boat. And that image is really powerful, because, in this struggle that we are having against settled colonialism, we can think in terms of how many arms do they have and how many arms do we do not have. It's in terms of the love that we have for the liberation of everybody in the third world. So yeah, thank you.
One more. Okay, we have like two related ones here. So yeah, I'll just do this again.
I'm dying to share this news with you all. First, thank you so much for this panel. I really needed it, but I have been exploding to share this news. It was just revealed, just within the past 30 minutes, that this afternoon, Abu Ubaida, the beautiful head of the military resistance in Gaza, they have captured an Israeli soldier. At least one Israeli soldier in Gaza.
But thank you. I'm just going to do a question up here.
This happened in Cuba too. People kept doing big statements.
I have a quick question. Thank you so much for being here. As a disabled person, I've had to really realign my relationship to revolutionary action over the course of dealing with my changing body. And I think something that's been really big for me in sustaining revolutionary optimism has been figuring out what roles there are beyond just being on the front lines, being in the streets. And so I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on, how people can conceptualize their different roles and play to their strengths and be invested in this movement in more creative ways, because I think a lot of people are not, willing or able to be in the front lines, and that stops them from participating. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to try to respond quickly to all of them, and my apologies if I don't go across the board. Okay, let me start with the armed struggle piece. I think on the front, it demands our own expansiveness to be able to understand, right? And it demands our honesty when we can't understand that armed struggle goes hand in hand with revolutionary process. Right? And what I mean by that is it's not about sort of excising the parts of us that might be uncomfortable with death, with dying, with horrific acts. I think we have to contend with that as people who are engaged in a struggle, that these things are not pretty, they're not romantic, right? That it includes suffering. We have to be honest with that. And then we have to be honest with what is it that stops us really. We'd be very honest with ourselves. What is it that stops us from falling short of saying, yes, we are supporting the armed struggle? We saw this very early on, the most revolutionary academics and all these people, and they just stopped short of that, right? I'm not even talking about the shameful both sides-isms that we saw as well. But what is it to be honest about that? What are the forces that stop us, that make us censor ourselves, that make us discipline ourselves, that make us discipline others who are bold and say, yeah, of course I do. And what I mean by that also is understand when we are honest with ourselves about why we're not expansive enough to say armed struggle is always part of this, it also is then saying we have to be honest about what we are relegating people to in its wake, right? In Gaza, if you're not with the armed struggle, you have to be honest about what it is you expect people in Gaza to do. Is to lay down and die. That's the short, and that doesn't mean that's not a difficult process. I don't want us to eliminate the difficult process internally because we understand materially what that means, but also we have to be honest about what we're actually saying, right? It's also reactionary and revisionist history, right? Because it's one thing to understand that things are not unicorns and butterflies and people suffer and 2 million people died, in Vietnam and 1 million people died in Algeria. We know these numbers, but to remember that there are processes that sanitize these historical struggles. So when we think about any struggle in the world that has led to liberation, and if we're like magically deleting and erasing that armed struggle was a part of that, whether it's apartheid South Africa or anywhere else, what is it that sanitizes these historical struggles and why? Right? So I'm more interested in us being honest about that and then helping each other have these conversations because they do include actual death, right? To the idea of what struggles, the Zapatistas are a central force for me. I remember I went to the American University of Beirut and I learned about the Zapatistas then. And part of what moves me about that is, of course, whether it's Subcomandante Ramona talking about we are all Marcos. We are all, right? All of us are involved in the struggle, and that goes to my sister in the struggle right back there, talking about we're all Marcos, meaning we all have a responsibility to be engaged in the revolutionary struggle, and it affects us all, but also in their feminist and non-hierarchical organizing in the midst of a world that would not have us imagine that is possible, right? That's the portal I'm talking about, right? Where they are avowed anarchist feminists, right, non-patriarchal, and saying there is a way to do this. There's a way to educate our people. There's a way to feed our people. There's a way to divest from the state, even within the state, and keep each other safe. This is the communal healing part of it. So education, armed struggle, communal caring, these are all part of the Zapatista movement. And so I'm always keeping that central. To the disability justice question, I think this is centerpiece, and there's a reason why disability justice folks, and I've sort of worked alongside them, and I have a piece coming out around disability justice as being part of the Palestinian liberation movement, because it also demands us to think that it's not always about having bodies in the street. That's part of it. But again, if we're thinking about all these ways in which revolution happens, we have to think about every single portal of entry. It can't just be an ableist notion of having people marching in the streets and even our language around that and who's included. It needs to be part of that. But to think about the settler colonial condition as one that disrupts, for example, movement, that disrupts people from access to care, that disrupts people from healthcare. So it is for us also to make these things known. So if we're not in the street, it's also us to shape the discourse and to make sure that we're representing everybody that's involved in this struggle, and to sort of speak to these ideas and make the links known. And I think that that is a huge part of what we've been seeing. If there is a rise in sort of consciousness building, it's because we're understanding these things as logics of oppression, and logics of oppression cut across movements and across sectors. And so I think, again, it's not to say, oh, this is a romantic notion of this includes everybody, like an all lives matter thing, right? That's not what we're talking about. But we are talking about the conditions that create oppression and suffering, and that has to be part of our analysis too.
Just to expand a little bit, or to expand on what Lara said around armed struggle, and to specifically your question, like, I think a quote that perfectly addresses this is is a Fidel Castro quote. So he says, "Revolutionaries didn't choose armed struggle as the best path. It's the path the oppressors imposed onto the people, and the people only have two choices: either they suffer or they fight." And so armed struggle is the necessary path to liberate ourselves from these conditions. And so I want to move on to your question, Wes. I know we were speaking earlier, but I look no further than the Black struggle here in this country, and specifically the Black Panther Party. I say this all the time because I feel like the things that the Palestinian movement has been able to build in this country, we are students of the Black struggle in this country, and me personally, I read a lot of their history and draw a lot of inspiration, and I look to Huey Newton's theory on intercommunalism, around the need in the cultural sort of values that capitalism instills onto us, that Lara spoke to earlier in her talk, and how we can collectively cultivate something that is opposed to capitalism and what capitalism thinks is normal for us. So instilling new values, new identities, and ultimately creating a new human culture, one that's based on dignity, based on honor, based on love, on liberation. And so I look to the Black Panther Party and to the Black revolutionaries of this country. I also look to the Black Panther Party in terms of how they've theorized their relationship to the masses and how they relate to the masses, to the Black community. They do social investigation to look at, well, what's the problem that the Black communities are facing here? Police brutality, poverty, all of these conditions, that they developed a political program that speaks to Black people in this country and the oppression that they face. And so I do have a lot of inspiration from that. And also around their internationalism, the Black Panther Party's internationalism with the Palestinian struggle. If you look at their monthly bulletin, the Black Panther Party was publishing the work of the Martyr Society in the refugee camps in Lebanon that Palestinians, this institution provided medical services to Palestinians in the refugee camp, and the Black Panther Party was writing about this and disseminating this in their communities. And so for me, yes, it's the Black Panther Party and the Black liberation struggle of this country that has really inspired me. And to your question around, offering, like, how can you offer in this moment beyond taking to the streets? And I think about this story that a comrade shared with me around an encampment where there was an elderly woman. Obviously, she's not able to participate in these really long marches and to be out in the streets consistently. But what her passion was and what she felt like her contribution in this moment was to cook for the students of the encampment and to make meals for them. And that is a way of sustaining struggle, of allowing others to, be on the front lines. And so I think my advice, because if I wasn't an organizer, I don't know what I would be contributing in this moment, but I would say find what you're passionate about and your skill sets that you know that you're amazing at, and you're offering that to the movement and offering it for the collective. So I think that's what I would say.
I would actually like 2 more questions. Okay. And quick.
Thank you so much for this panel. I do want to say that I haven't heard the term revolutionary optimism discussed for probably 30 to 40 years in this country. So the fact that you are discussing this feeds and nourishes my revolutionary optimism, of course. And I also want to note that something that I think is implicit in everything, certainly talking about Wissam Rafibi, is the role that prisoners have played in the sustaining of revolutionary optimism in all movements, in this country, political prisoners, and in Palestine, obviously. So my question, which I kind of hate to say, but I maybe you can briefly talk to me. There is also sort of the U.S. commodification of hope. You think of Obama. You think of so many different. Resilience is now the word that everyone loves to apply to the Palestinians dying in Gaza. It makes me sick when I hear the term resilience. So what is the difference? How would you distinguish between the American trope of hope and revolutionary optimism?
So first of all, I just want to, I'm an organizer of GW SJP, so we love you, Lara. But my question is, how do you cultivate revolutionary optimism in instances of trauma? My mom, for example, grew up in the Lebanese Civil War, and she lives in DC, and she just won't come out to her actions because she's tired. She said she just wants peace. And I've tried to explain like the revolutionary vision, and she just doesn't buy in. She's so exhausted, and she continues to relive this, like the Israeli occupation and the war and her family members dying 20, 30 years later. And so I guess I'm asking on a material level and also on a psychological level, if that makes sense. How would I go about mobilizing her, you know?
Let me start with Mama. Yeah. First of all, I love you all. I draw inspiration from you all, so thank you for all your work. What I'd say first is that there's a way in which the symptom of stuckness is telling us something. And so sometimes our impulse is to push through that stuckness, and that can be called trauma or whatever. There's a whole trauma industry around people never being able to work through their trauma. And so I don't hold that to be the truth. And yet there are ways in which we remain stuck in our trauma. There's a lot of Lebanese that are stuck in their trauma, right, around the war and all sort of that. So I don't want to say it's not real, but there's a way in which that's fed in a particular way. And I think to be able to read that as an actual process and part of snuffing out people's revolutionary fire, that is an actual tactic that the state uses, that history uses, whether it's the Lebanese state or you know, failed states or this settler colonial state. So number one is understanding that symptom of stuckness is communicating something, right? But I want to say something else, and this is maybe how, is that sometimes it's also not speaking to that stuckness. It's also recognizing that you are your mother's daughter and you are not stuck. I mean that as a slogan. I mean that something in Mama that can't move her was able to move you, and she didn't get in your way. So it moves through you. And that's part of it, is the collapsing of time, is to be like, Mama has that stuckness, and also you don't, and that's part of what we are also thinking about, right? So the thing that would have us be like, oh, that's resilient, it's not that. It's that there's something expansive enough, even with that stuckness, that birthed that within you, right? That's what I want you to focus on. It's very hard to move on to this, but I want to give time to Lina and everything else to move to what's the difference between resilience and all that. I hate the word resilience as a psychologist. I teach my students all the time. He knows, my cousin is right there. He knows what I think about resilience. Partially because resilience individualizes the process and then defangs and depoliticizes what it actually means to be revolutionary and a struggler, and that's on purpose. Psychology is created on purpose to stabilize these processes and to sort of defang and depoliticize and individualize, and that's why I don't use the word resilience. But I think that the difference that I would see between revolutionary optimism and hope is that the hope, the Obama hope, this is actually, Lara started to laugh because that's precisely what I said in my talk, is we're not talking about that sort of thing. That's the sort of thing that is insatiable. That type of hope goes nowhere. The reason why we have to keep buying hopeful, t-shirts and hope this and watch and constantly watch is because it is based in alienation, right? And I think there's something that hits differently, that hits viscerally about revolutionary optimism when we can also hope it's not an empty or flat affect that is devoid of the pain. I think there's a toxic positivism to that type of hope that just says, oh, we're going to hope but not look at all the pain that's there. And we're not being afraid of the pain and understanding that there's expansiveness, that revolutionary optimism also means taking in all the cracks in your heart and still waking up every single day and committing to the future that we are bringing into being through that pain. That's, I think, the difference for me.
We will have to cut it now, unfortunately. We have a plenary at 7:15, but thank you all so much for being in the community with us today.